Well, might have to put my glasses on. Clark Hughes. Written by Clark. Skip Cope is a member of the Colonel David Lang Camp 1314 in Tallahassee, Florida. And it is entitled Robert E. Lee. And it says, Robert E. Lee, a gentle soul, his virtues I will now extol. His simple faith and love for God had no pretense and no facade. Loved his family, his dear wife, and loved Virginia in his life. Called upon to serve its cause with no reward and no applause. For the South he fought to save, with every battle always brave. From the first to the very last, living life with grace and class. All who knew him, foe or friend, could only praise him in the end. Not many men could dare compare, always faithful, true, and fair. I often wish my life could be much more like Robert E. Lee.
Yeah.
Woo!
Himself up to editor, and now he's retired. His wife's the lawyer. She's now retired, so their children are gone, and they're doing a lot of traveling. Just recently, I know he's been to Russia and Ireland and France, and his wife, is it your wife's a Dillon, right? Or is it you?
What's that?
Dillard, is that your wife?
She's a Dillon.
Dillon, yeah. His wife's a Dillon, and he's got a lot of neat stories. He's started out with a 40-page brochure. Now he's got about 400 pages. One of his relatives was on a Titanic. He was a coal sweeper in the coal rooms, and when the Titanic went down, he saw somebody drop a bottle, so he helped himself, and somehow got overboard, and just out of mercy, they rolled back to pick him up. He was so drunk and obnoxious, they almost left him there. They finally pulled him in, and when he woke up the next morning, he was underneath a pile of dead bodies, and on and on. So he's got a lot of neat stories about his family as well, and he's always been a Civil War buff and has some ancestors in the Civil War, and he wrote this book. If you're a loyal Confederate, he'll sell it to you for only $15 tonight. It's really well researched, and it's got a lot to do with people around here. He was also very responsible for that great book the Kansas City Star did on the Civil War in this area. There's probably 5 or 6 or 10 people you know in here, and that's for sale for $15 tonight too. And tonight, no doubt, being a newspaper man, he was very interested in the subject of what happened and what side were the newspapers on during the Civil War here, and so he's got a lot of stories and things to share with us. Darrell Levings.
All right. Thank you all for having me. Thank you for the dinner, which I'm still going to be eating tomorrow, I think.
Excellent.
Wonderful. And I'm really glad I got to come to this place and know this place, and I'm going to bring some people back here just to get them out of town. Come back to a place where I used to work. I worked in Independence for several years as a reporter, and so when the office was on Liberty, this was before it was down on the square. Well, I don't know. I was just feeling from my phone, which I guess I left in my coat, which I left in my car. So I don't know what time it is, and I don't know.
It's 10 after 7 right now.
10 after 7. When would you like me to be done?
I'll go like
9 or
that.
10 o'clock at night, is that all right with you?
What's that?
9 or 10 o'clock
Oh,
tonight?
you don't know me. One editor once called me a man of many words on paper and verbally. I never stop talking, but I do not want to abuse your hospitality.
Well, you just go until you get
Until the steam
tired.
starts coming in and we have to get back to the cars and scrape
When you
our
see
windshields,
2 or more
right?
men gone to sleep, then it's time to stop.
All right. Well, again, thank you for having me. I haven't been doing a lot of Civil War talking. As he mentioned, I've been spending a year working on Irish history from the invasion of the Normans of Ireland right up to, well, Paddy and such. I'm also working on some books on a black policeman who was really here in Kansas City. He was the only black policeman on the police force during the Big Jim Pendergast days, and I'm probably a little bit into Tom Pendergast days. So only by that time, by Tom Pendergast, there were a couple more black policemen. But so I'm writing this, fun. I'm using real history and real people, and my first book points out that the publisher of the Kansas City Star's daughter was a drunk. And so I still got that published, believe it or not. So, as you all know, the war was different here than it was out east. And that goes for newspapering as well. First of all, out east, you know, which included Chicago, but, you know, in those days it was Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, certainly New York and Boston. You know, those cities would have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 newspapers, different languages. And a little bit of that occurred out here as well. In those cities, the newspaper, their population was such that they had actually steam-powered newspapers working off big rolls of paper. If you look at those presses today and blew them up by 4 or 5 times, that'd be the presses that you got at the Kansas City Star. Big rolls of paper, huge rolls of paper, crush you if they rolled over you. But out here, what do you got? You got little sheets of paper, cut sheets of paper. And you got a machine where you run a crank and it run the little, the ink will run over the, or you spread the ink over the backward type, and then you put the paper down and you run a press over it, that's the name, and then you let it dry, and then you run it back through on the other side. You get 2 pages. And here are some of the local papers. Why don't you just pass those around? Don't try to read them, because I don't want to pay for your glasses or your seeing eye dog. But most of those, it's all ads on the front page. If you want to go to news, you go to more or less the second page or the third page. You know, they knew how to make money. And unlike the big papers in New York, the Herald and the Times and all of those, with their big presses here, all you needed was a wagon. You could put your press in the wagon and your cases of type in there, and you could go from town to town and set up a newspaper. In fact, you know, they did. And the Kansas City Star, you know, was set up in a little tiny room down in the River Market area. That's how it's got its start. The building that we're in now, the old brick building, is about the 5th Kansas City Star office. The second that was actually built as a newspaper building. Before, they were always just, you know, you take a space, you know, you storefront or whatever. Boy, we got the 7th grade track meet going on upstairs, don't we?
I saw some little kids up there. It's like, where's parents nowadays? Kids act like animals in public nowadays.
So anyway, I want you guys to ask me questions. You just put your hand up, ask me questions as we go along. I'm going to do quite a bit of reading. I have to apologize. I haven't memorized the script, but this is the other night I used it for the 2nd time in more than a year. So anyway, talking about the New York newspapers, here's an interesting fact. As you all know, in 1863, the Irish rioted because of the draft. And it was pretty tense in the streets of New York. And so tense, in fact, that the New York Times had a Gatling gun on their roof in case things got just a little too crazy.
Because of the rats or the Irish?
Yeah, they're only Irish, for God's sakes. They're filth, they're scum, they're snot. Gun them down. You know, why did we let them in the first place? Irish need not apply. But as you know, I mean, the newspapers were everything in those days as far as communication. That and a personal letter. I mean, there was no TV, there was certainly no internet, there was no radio. Everything was in the newspaper, and therefore that's why, you know, in the old days there were so many newspapers. But anyway, in our area, we didn't have Gatling guns on the roofs. We were lucky some days that we had a roof. And I like to say I love that movie True Grit, and I love at the end where Cole Younger tells the lady who's lost her arm to the rattlesnake. She says, you know, those were lively times. And yes, they indeed were. They were no livelier for just about anybody than for editors. So as we know, in the period of the 1850s, slavery, whether Kansas would go slave or free, was, you know, the dominating factor. And newspapers set up in Kansas. Some of them were pro free soil, and some of them were pro-slavery. The one I especially like was from a Missourian named John Stringfellow, wow, I love that name, who published the Squatter Sovereign in Kansas. And this was at a time when obviously the Missourians were coming over in droves and trying to influence the outcome of the elections and the Constitution and everything. And he wrote, and let me just say this is not fake news. If murder and assassination is the program of the day, we are in favor of filling the bill. Let not the knives of the pro-slavery men be sheathed while there is one abolitionist in the territory. Let our motto be written in blood upon our flag, death to all Yankees and traitors in Kansas. Okay, so how do you think he felt about that issue?
What was the name of that paper again?
That was the Squatter Sovereign.
Okay.
I'd like to really know how he really felt.
Yeah. So I suspect that paper lasted probably a year or two. Like I say, they put the press back in the
He
wagon
was dead.
got the hell out of town when it looked like it was the
tar and feathers.
the free soilers were going to take over. The one Kansas preacher described as a pacifist, and he really is. I mean, if you look at it in history.
Where was that paper set up? Was it in Lawrence or?
Oh, that's a good question. You could find it, but I knew one time, I knew 3 years ago, 4 years ago when I put the script together. I don't remember it, but it would have been in East Kansas.
Eastern Kansas?
And I would think it would have been in. I believe that it was in Northeast Kansas.
Around the Manhattan area?
I'm
maybe?
sorry, called my bluff already. But anyway, one Kansas preacher, and again I once knew his name, and he was actually described in historical accounts as a pacifist. And he said Missourians were demons from the bottomless pit.
Yeah.
It might be shot with impunity. So, the lines were drawn. In 1855, here's where we get to another new. There was a group called the Platte County Self-Defense Association. And they were unhappy with the Parkville Industrial Luminary. There is a newspaper name, Parkville Industrial Luminary. For their stands, because the Industrial Luminary, this was one of the editors, one of the two owner editors was a guy named
George Park.
George Park. I couldn't remember his first name. And as Parkville is named for him, and Park College is named for him. And so Park happened to be out of town when the Platte County Self-Defense Association came up and self-defensed his newspaper by taking the press and the type and throwing it, as much of it as they could in the river. Say some of that type did survive and was smuggled across the river and was used by free soil men. The next year, that was 1855, and 1856, the self-defense guys, or they had a different name then, they were called border ruffians, I believe, went to Lawrence. And the same thing pretty much happened to 3 newspapers. Are you pointing at me like you?
No, it was just making me think of the raid on Lawrence. I didn't know if it was.
You're talking about the Quantrill raid of
Correct.
63? No, this is 56.
Oh.
This is when the
very
sheriff.
beginning. Okay.
Right. This is when John Brown and his boys were down south of Lawrence.
That's what I
Okay. In fact, this event freaked John Brown out, and he went on to fame with his broadswords, or infame. So they wiped out the Free State and the Herald of Freedom. The Missourians were throwing the stuff in the river, but they got tired, and then they burned the papers and the broken bits in the street. You were asking about Stringfellow. He sold his paper to a guy named Samuel Pomeroy, a Massachusetts Free Stater. So, he didn't take his press back to Missouri. He basically sold out and got a buck off the machinery. That became the Immigrant Aid Company's Freedom's champion. Now, like I say, it really didn't take much to get a newspaper. And in Wyandotte City, which was what we know as KCK today, but it was just a little tiny piece of KCK today on the river right across from that Westport landing. They had the Commercial Gazette, the Western Argus, Wyandotte Citizen, and Wyandotte City Reporter. All three, the Argus was pro-slavery, the rest were Republican or Free State. And Quindaro, which today is kind of a part of KCK, it's up on the north.
Quindaro?
Hmm?
Like Quindaro?
Quindaro, yeah. You think I'm mispronouncing it? I probably am. Quindaro. They had two papers at least, the Kansas Tribune, and as you know, it was part of the Underground Railroad, and something called the Chidawan, which is a Wyandotte word for leader.
Before you get too far away from Park and Parkville,
Uh-huh.
his paper, The Luminary, was considered to be abolitionist, and he was from Connecticut, but he owned slaves.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Right?
Oh, he was an abolitionist, he owned slaves.
Yeah. So
Well, there was a lot of people who were pro-union and owned slaves,
Yeah.
but I wasn't. Okay.
I think so.
Most of the slaves
Trying to
are owned by
think how you can
union
rationalize that.
corporations anyway.
Yeah.
What's that?
Most of the slaves are owned by union corporations anyway. They had businesses in the South.
Well, we could talk about that, but we won't tonight. In 1860, Mr. Tyler, the editor of the Wyandotte Commercial Gazette, was brutally assaulted by a fellow who was one of the kidnappers of black men in Kansas and shipping them back. So it was a pretty rough time. In 1861, now we get to the beginning of the war, Kansas City was in some turmoil. Southern people were beating up northern people in the streets, according to some accounts. And at that time, the newspaper kind of shut down until we found our equilibrium. Kansas City had the Inquirer, the Free State Republican, and the Missouri Post. The Missouri Post was a German paper, published in German. But the most important paper was the Western Journal of Commerce. Sometimes the daily, sometimes the weekly. And the journal actually lasted through to World War II. You know where Crown Center kind of that complex where the hotel is, what used to be the Hyatt Hotel, and now I don't know what it's called. I don't know what hotel that was. The one that fell, the one that had the collapse.
Killed everybody.
Yeah, 114 people. Where the hotel is, in that building that kind of goes to the north, garage, and I think an office building, that is where the journal sat. I can actually remember it being there. And you guys are as old as I am, but you probably didn't have to work 5 blocks from it like I did most of my life. But anyway, that's when they built the Crown Center. They tore down that building. Now those. The Journal had been a Democratic paper, that is, it supported Douglas, the little giant, in the 4-way election, but when the war broke out, it was flat out, very staunchly Union. That was one of the bigger papers, but again, it was really small. As everybody knows, Kansas City was a bow-hung dot on the river. I mean, Leavenworth was twice as big. St. Joseph was more than twice as big. Leavenworth was the...
Kansas City was a cow town.
What's that?
Kansas City was a cow town back then too, still. Was it a cow town back then still?
Leavenworth?
Kansas City.
No, not really.
Cow
The
town.
cow towning occurred after the Civil War.
Then-
There were no stockyards, so to speak. And no meatpacking plants, and that came from the river, and that came from the bridge. So that came from the bridge, which I might mention a little bit later. Well, anyway, for a small paper, the war meant a lot of different problems. Setting aside people coming into town and burning you out, even if they didn't come to your town and burn you out, you had problems because, paper. Paper doesn't just grow out of potato skins. It has to be ragged and wood pulped and everything, and made in some eastern city, or not necessarily a city, but it probably was coming from Canada or the North Woods, Michigan and Wisconsin. Had to come down the river, had to come up the river, and so the Emporia News, which I found some interesting little clips from when I wrote this, they give you kind of good insight of what's going on. June 3, 1861. Now, see, that's right at the beginning. We haven't had Wilson's Creek yet, we haven't had Bull Run, right? He writes, The editor writes, "No paper has been issued from this office for 2 weeks previous to this. We hate apologies and shall make none. We will only state that 2 weeks ago we had no paper, and last week we were short of hands. Our foreman, Charlie Stotler, went off with the Emporia Guards to Lawrence to handle a different kind of shooting stick." Now the thing that you when you were putting together a newspaper, the thing that you had in your hand as you're pulling tie to make a line of type is a stick. So I've never heard it called a shooting stick at the journalism school, but anyway, everybody knew what he was talking about. And he says, and we were left in the lurch. Whenever any of our hands wish to go off to enlist in the cause of the government, we shall give them a patriotic slap on the shoulder and tell them to go, paper or no paper. The next year, 1862, I think this is pretty cute, he said, there will be no paper issued from this office next week for the following reasons. The editor and the foreman have vegetables to take care of and another work to do to prepare for winter. Now there's a man who's thinking straight. You know, he's got his priorities straight. I got to have some potatoes and root vegetables to get my family through the winter. Of course, another issue in Missouri, Kansas wasn't so. Kansas was. We'll talk about a few issues in Kansas, but in general, Missouri editors had a lot bigger problem. So what do you think that bigger problem might be? Well, it might be the U.S. Army in the shape of Kansas militia or Iowans or whoever that really didn't have much sympathy for the independent approach that a lot of Missourians and Missouri editors took. They didn't want to have any, didn't really want to join either side at first, and certainly didn't want to be occupied by a bunch of bluebellies from other states. I could talk about Palmyra, but that's a little far from here. In June 1862, the Army put the editors and publishers of the Leavenworth Enquirer, that's in Kansas, of course, but it was a Democratic newspaper. Now, you could vote Democratic and you still weren't voting for secession. I mean, if you voted for Douglas, you voted Democratic. But things were getting so tense and so partisan that was considered basically, this was even before the term copperhead had probably been termed. And they were already throwing editors into the guardhouse for not towing, the line. And of course, in the beginning of the war in the Washington area, the situation was really crisis. I mean, there was even an editor in Iowa who did not toe the line, and he was put in prison. That far out. So the authorities, the generals and the colonels and whoever was provost marshals and such in the area, they were very, very sensitive, and they were very, very, as both sides were, they were very patriotic, and they were quick on the draw when it came time to throw somebody in the clink.
So they didn't care much for freedom of speech back then.
My hearings are in, but they're not.
So they didn't care much for freedom of the press back then.
Oh, the habeas corpus and Abraham Lincoln were not exactly in a parallel course in the beginning, as he was trying to keep it together out there. No, that is absolutely true.
What was our approximate population at the time?
Kansas City's?
Yes, because I know Independence was way on out there. Lee Summit was way on out there.
I think Kansas City was about 4,000.
Wow. So it wasn't that big.
Well, it had to be 4,000. It could be 400. I mean, because it was already bigger than Westport, and Westport had like 400 or so.
Yeah, they outgrew Westport pretty quick.
I would say it's about 4,000, and Leavenworth is about 8 or 9, and St. Joseph's about 9 or 10. You can, if you look it up and find out I'm wrong, I apologize. But
Was Independence bigger than Kansas City, you think?
Yeah, it might have been. And I don't really know how much bigger. The Independence would have suffered from the shutting off of the trails, just like Kansas City did, and Westport did especially. and I would think by that time, everybody, a lot of people were taking the boats on up north and hopping off at Omaha and places like that to go across, because it was, a day or two shorter.
Yeah.
So, Independence might have been nearly the same size, but I'm trying to remember a touchstone. I'm pretty sure Independence was smaller. Kansas City had taken over even without the bridge at that point. So let's see. So they put in the editors and publishers of the Leavenworth Inquirer, a Democratic paper, and the Guardian. The Emporia News wrote it was an infamous rebel sheet. He's just Democrat, but always puffing and eulogizing rebel leaders and their cause, defaming and belying the administration and the cause of free government. So then in August of that year, that would still be 62, the 6th Kansas Cavalry rode into Independence to shut down the Border Star, which they called, quote, a copperhead paper, referring to it as a lying, dirty sheet. You see that in federal records. Now, I was confused by this. Apparently, the Westport paper, which was the Border Star, couldn't keep going. Westport was shrinking and everything. And so they put out kind of a combined paper with the Kansas City Inquirer and the Independence Herald. They merged into one paper. So it's not totally clear what was the masthead. What is totally clear is that, quote, my first act was to place under arrest McCarthy, the editor. Having no means at hand of removing the material, I ordered the type of the office to be destroyed, reported Major Willis Ransom. So this happened again and again. The newspapers either towed the line or the union officers would come in and make it hard for them. Now I'm going to branch off just a little bit. I'm going to talk about two people who were newspaper editors who really are very interesting in our history.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Certainly. I'm sorry I can't
ask
hear you.
you a
Speak
question
up.
real quick. You kept saying copperhead. Can I ask you what you mean by the term copperhead paper?
Well, Copperheads was became as the war went on, the Democratic faction, not necessarily supported by General McClellan, but there was a faction in the North, especially in Indiana and some parts of northern New York, that were very anti-Lincoln, very anti-war, and they wanted to make peace with the South and let them have whatever they wanted, including perhaps to even break away and become their own nation. And the rest of the North really did not care for these people in their midst and disparaged them as in the term copperhead. And so there, and you could be a very patriotic pro-union Democrat, but you also had Democrats who were willing to do anything to stop this war and even sabotage union efforts politically and otherwise.
So is it kind of like an insult putting Lincoln on a copper penny?
Well, surely
Back, isn't it?
you know that penny's not copper anymore, so it doesn't matter.
It's not? Oh.
So, two stories about who I think are very interesting people. One is Robert Van Horn. Now, I mentioned the newspaper that lasted the longest and was the strongest paper in the area. That was the Western, the Western Journal of Commerce, or was it the Journal of Western Commerce? I always get that confused. He came over here as a lawyer from St. Louis and took over the paper and immediately got in a duel with Leavenworth about which city was full of rats and scum and cholera germs. And he was a big booster, huge booster of Kansas City. And then the war broke out, and suddenly he saw that the city was awash in Southern sympathizers, and he didn't care for that, being from the East. And so he went back to St. Louis and asked Fremont to, you know, that said the city could go southern if you don't do something. And as a result of that, or about the same time as that, suddenly we have a troop of dragoons down here from Leavenworth to calm things down. Now, you may remember that troop of dragoons came out toward Independence, where there was an encampment of Southerners, and had their first little fight where the Southerners distinguished themselves by shooting their commander. Accidentally, I suppose. But there was a lot of drinking going on, so I'm sure it was an accident. But anyway, Van Horn came back and was a very, very energetic organizing and settle fellow, and he raised a battalion of Union troops, you know, and they built Fort Union there right across the street from Coates House on Quality Hill. And they had 3 companies. They had a German company and an Irish company and, you know, regular old American company. And George Caleb Bingham, the famous artist who later painted Order Number 11, but he was famous as a portrait artist and also a recorder of the American political scene on the frontier. That's what he's probably most famous for. He was in charge of the Irish company. Well, what was the first major thing that occurred over on this side of the state in the war? And that would be Lexington. And as we know, the Colonel Mulligan brought some Illinois troops over and decided to try to hold Lexington, which was much more prosperous and powerful than Kansas City at the time, against Price, who's marching up from Arkansas. And we know how that came out. Mulligan had to surrender because he didn't have enough water, and in the Battle of the Bales and all that other good stuff. Mulligan had to surrender his troops, which included Van Horn's 3 companies and another unit from St. Joseph, and this was Peabody, Colonel Peabody's regiment. Colonel Peabody was a railroad man, again, over the east, and they all got bottled up at Lexington, and they all had to surrender. Well, Price did not, and Price knew that Fremont would come his way, as you all know Missouri history, so he wanted to leave, and he was not interested in taking a lot of prisoners that had to be fed and washed. And so he paroled all of these troops. Well, the Union later said, the hell with that. You just surrendered and were paroled by a Missouri State Guard general. You didn't surrender and were paroled by a Confederate force. Therefore, the hell with it. Your paroles are worthless. Your surrender is worthless. And they shipped them, put them back in uniform. All these guys said, well, I think we're done with the war now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We fought, we fit a battle. I think we're done. No, you're not done, said the U.S. government. And they gave them new uniforms, they gave them new rifles, and they shipped them to a little place, what was that called? Shiloh Landing, down in Tennessee. Well, these Missourians, and by this time they're called the 25th Missouri Regiment. These Missourians are nervous about this. They kept saying, we did surrender, we gave our word, we would not take up arms. We don't like this very much. Well, if you know the story of the Battle of Shiloh, you know that there was one army on the south side of that river, and one of the divisions was run by Sherman, and another was eventually ended up under Peabody, the man who had the 25th, his 25th, and a couple other regiments made up a division. I think it was a division, not just a brigade. And they were all scattered out. And Grant was remarkably careless and was waiting for another army to march down from Ohio and to join him before they marched on and took Corinth, which was a big railroad junction in the South, a very major junction. And as you know, General Johnston of the South really wasn't interested in waiting for that other Ohio army to show up, and he started moving up the Corinth Road toward Shiloh Landing. Well, all of these regiments and divisions were scattered all over the south, on the south bank of the Tennessee River. And the southernmost encampment was the Missourians under Peabody. And Peabody was nobody's fool. And he did, and Sherman was practically pissing his pants. He knew there were Confederates out there and they were close by, and he couldn't believe that nobody was taking up defensive positions and things like that. And everybody thought that, Sherman was considered to be half crazy when the war started. I mean, he was always very pessimistic. He thought it was going to take, 1 million men to subdue the South, and everybody thought he was crazy. And I think he was, overburdened by the fact that he understood what was happening to the country and what would happen militarily better than almost anybody, so many other people did. He was a very wise man. And anyway, Peabody also was of the mind, although he really wasn't in communication with Sherman, although they might have talked the night before, when the generals gathered. And he did not like it, and he said, boys, probably told Van Horn, he said, I think this is crazy. The first thing in the morning, I want you to send 3 companies down that road, and I want to know who's down there and who's down there. Those 3 companies got up that morning, and they just dawn was breaking, and they're marching down that side. And you know what they found? They found a very large Confederate army boiling up that road right into their teeth. And they started shooting, and they fell back, and pickets were firing, and the companies were finding to positions. And Peabody is back up at camp, and he says, well, we better, I don't know what's going on down there, but send some more people down there. About this time, his commander rides up and says, if you started a battle here, your ass is grass. We don't want no battles until we're ready. The hell what the Southerners are doing. This is true. And he went on to become the hero. This guy, Baldwin, our guy, Peabody, later became the so-called hero, or a hero of Hornet's Nest. That was probably overblown as well. He really wasn't a very good officer. Well, anyway, Peabody suddenly, the 25th Missouri and the 3rd Iowa and a few other regiments are just completely wiped out and overwhelmed as they come in. Peabody was shot 5 times trying to rally his men to hold the line, to not, to let this massive Confederate force overrun them. The 5th bullet went through his mouth and out the back of his neck. So there are very, very few monuments to anybody at Shiloh. It's very, very different than Gettysburg or Manassas or places like that. There's only about 2 or 3 people who were actually mentioned of monuments, and Peabody was one of them. The interesting thing, Van Horn was a very famous man in Missouri history, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But if you read his biographies, from the late 1800s, and I have read my share of them, and it always mentions that, that he was at Lexington, and it always mentions that he was later at Corinth, but it never mentions Shiloh. Never, ever mentioned Shiloh. So what was Robert Van Horn doing when his commander, Peabody, takes a bullet in the mouth? Everybody is running like hell. He is facing a giant wave of gray uniforms, screaming men, Confederate flags. What did he do?
Turn tail and run, huh?
I think he probably did. We know a lot of the I shouldn't say a lot, some of the 25th Missouri ended up in the Hornet's Nest, which was not the place to be if you really wanted to live and have children and keep your whatever. It was a bad place, as you very well know. Marmaduke was wounded on the Confederate side of the Hornet's Nest. I suspect that maybe he was still trying to pull them together. Who knows? But I think a lot of the 25th Missouri ended up on the banks of the river, praying for the next steamboat to take them out of his hell. And they weren't the only ones. It wasn't just the 25th Missouri.
They were Union Missourians?
Yes.
Yeah, this
Yeah, from Illinois and Kansas City. 25th Missouri.
If I remember, I understand some of them that when they decided to go Confederate, a lot of them switched. Is that true?
I don't think so. No. I think these guys were especially nervous about the situation because if they thought if they were captured, they'd be shot. Because they had broken their, in their minds, they had broken their parole at Lexington. But the Union Army, like I say, the lawyers in the Union Army said, no, that doesn't count. So, but I also think that, you know, when you're outnumbered, when you're just getting up out of your tent, which a lot of them were, you know, you were just finishing your breakfast and suddenly you see a wave of men coming at you who want to kill you. You can take a shot at them, but you know, you're not going to stay around and fight them Davy Crockett style like with the Alamo. You're going to get the hell out and look for another line. There was no other line. So, we don't know where Mr. Van Horn was. We do know that the U.S. Army did not trust the 25th Missouri after that, not to be a line unit. They made them engineers, which got them back off the front line, which probably made the ones who are still worried about this parole problem a little calmer. It gets a little shaky in there. I have to tell you that I have not made a study of the 25th Missouri, but I do note these two things about them. I think some of them in Van Horn were sent back to the boot heel of Missouri to try to build railroad bridges through the swamp, which has to be one of the most thankless tasks in the Union Army. Were they being punished?
Clearly.
I mean, really. But the 25th Missouri, as you know, in 1864, October, or was it late September, there was a trainload of engineers stopped at a little place called Centralia by Bloody Bill's men. You know what happened to them? They were all gunned down. Those were 25th Missouri engineers. Now, they might have been recruited later, whether any of them were originally in Shiloh, you know, who knows? Who has the time to go look at the names and the rosters and everything? I don't, certainly. It's interesting that Van Horn got a little bit of experience building bridges, I guess, in the Boot Hill, because he was later sent to Congress, and he's the one who got the first bridge built across the Missouri River at Kansas City, the ASB Bridge. As a congressman, he got the paperwork through in a bill before St. Joseph and Leavenworth could, which is why we're the big dogs and they're the little dogs. So, and I'll come back to him in just a minute when we get to the price rate. Even after the war, Van Horn came back and took over the paper again. I don't think he had it all the time. I think he would sell it to editors and friends, and then he'd take it back over again. But anyway, Van Horn is one of the most important people in Kansas City history. And there is that one little spot that you can't find out where he was or what he was doing. So, I'm sorry, this is Mr. Van Horn. I don't have any pictures of these people in uniform, you know, and of course, there weren't that many photo operations in Kansas City, but there should have been some. I mean, even Jesse Gaines got his picture taken, for God's sakes. The next person is another Yankee, an even more hated Yankee. Daniel Anthony.
Oh, Leavenworth guy.
Yeah, a villain to Southern Missourians. He was from the East. He went to Leavenworth as an abolitionist. He helped set up a paper called The Conservative. I look at my notes occasionally, make sure I'm not forgetting something here. There were several newspapers in Leavenworth, which, as I said, was larger than Kansas City. On the other hand, St. Louis was larger than Chicago. It was a major city. It had the saloons and whorehouses to prove it. It also had, by 1861, it had seen 14 different newspapers. Now remember, Kansas only became a state in 1860. Or was it 61? Was it January 61? I can't remember. Anyway, by that time, this town had 14 newspapers. It had German newspapers, It even had, and I find this hard to believe, a French newspaper. How many French men were in Leavenworth to support a newspaper? I don't know. The two major papers were the Conservative, Mr. Anthony's, and the Times. Anthony was allied with Senator James Lane, the burner of Osceola. The Times was allied with Governor Kearney. Kearney and Lane hated each other. Lane was constantly taking the powers of the governor to himself. It was the governor's job to raise troops. Lane did it himself. Lane appointed the officers, whereas it was the governor's prerogative to name officers. Lane, if you appreciate Lane, you know he was crazy as a bat. But what the hell? It doesn't mean you can't be a good newspaper man. Or, excuse me, can't be a good U.S. Senator. Anthony, he's a funny character. In 1861, oh, by the way, in 1859, Abraham Lincoln took the train from Hannibal to St. Joseph and then crossed the river. Bitter, bitter winter. You know, if you go to Fort Leavenworth, you'll see the sled that Lincoln took from the ferry at St. Joseph down to Leavenworth. And he actually met with Anthony. He sat around and they burned law books to keep warm around a stove. And they were out of date law books apparently. And they had a good talk. Although Anthony eventually voted for Douglas. The choice was clear, but anyway. But anyway, once the Lincoln became president, he was a rabid supporter. In 1861, as things were just warming up, he heard that over in Weston, which is basically just across the river from Leavenworth, that somebody had raised a secession flag. And he decided to take a couple men over there and pull it down, show those goddamn Missourians that we can't be doing this kind of traitorous horseshit. And he goes over there and he discovers that the Westonians are rather fond of this flag. And a lot of guns are suddenly produced, and suddenly the better part of valor is to get back to Leavenworth and write a story about this rather than pull down the actual flag.
Bad they didn't shoot him right there.
Yeah, they could have, and then we've been saved a lot of trouble. He got back, and it was noted in town, in Leavenworth, and one of the other editors at a competing paper who didn't like Anthony. And by not liking Anthony, you join 99.999.3% of the American population. He was the most disliked, unlikable person in the Western frontier. Only his sister liked him. And anyway, the Leavenworth Herald's editor wrote something in his newspaper impugning Anthony's spying, whether it was a color or not. And Anthony took offense at this, and one day, just like Matt Dillon in Dodge City, suddenly there were two editors on the street of Leavenworth. Shots rang out. Leavenworth was short one editor. Unfortunately, it wasn't Anthony. Anthony sold the Conservative to a guy named D.W. Webb in November '61 because he thought there was a better career to be had in the U.S. Army at that point. The U.S. Army at that point, as you know, he became second in command to a fellow we all know as Colonel Doc Jennison. This was the first, at that time it was known as the 1st Kansas Cav, later became known as the 7th Kansas Cav. Doc Jennison was too busy playing poker in Kansas, so it was Anthony who ended up burning Columbus, excuse me. In Dayton? Is that the other
Dayton, Columbus, and Rose Hill
Yeah.
on Christmas Eve.
That was our friend Anthony. There was a New York Times reporter with Anthony, and he pointed out how Anthony loved to get these Missouri farmers, rich Missouri farmers, and have them cut wood and everything for the Kansas troops. You know, just make them haul water and everything else, humiliate them, and take their food, their hands and their cattle, their horses and their mules and their carriages and their wagons and their slaves and anything else that wasn't nailed down. This was called, that word we called jayhawking. And I've always been amazed that a modern American university can name a football team after war criminals, but they do it. But as Webb Wilder wrote to the protest, jayhawking was got up in Kansas. It is one of our things. It works well. We believe in it. We are going to have it. It doesn't make any difference whether the authorities, civil or military, believe in it or not. Kansas don't care much for authorities. Never did, never will. So the problem was that the 7th, by now I think it was been renamed the 7th Cav. The 7th Cav, for every Confederate they thought they killed, they actually created 7 more. People, you know, furious with them, wanting to get revenge or whatever. I don't know whether, no, it wasn't the 7th Cav that shot Cole Younger's dad, it was somebody else. 7th Cav was taken off at the border and sent to Tennessee, because they were causing so much trouble. They were, you know. Well, this didn't suit Jennison, who was not really wearing a uniform to be a soldier. He was wearing a uniform to do whatever the hell he wanted to do. And Anthony wasn't far off of that, and another young man they had in their unit was called a man named Hoyt. You know, Hoyt, he later became the leader of the Redlegs. All of these men did not really want to be soldiering. They wanted to be back in Kansas, stealing from Missourians. And Anthony was, he did go, and Hoyt said that he was too fragile to deal with the southern weather. Anthony went and he was arrested, thrown in the guardhouse and everything for disobeying orders. So he comes back. He sold his newspaper. He's not an officer anymore. So what the hell, let's just become mayor of Leavenworth. In those days, Mayor Leavenworth or Kansas City or whatever was a one-year term. And he had an interesting year. He started off his position as mayor as burning out the homes of pro-South men in the town, leading a mob. He also had the Times editor arrested for disturbing the peace. The Times editor, disturbing the peace, he had written a story critical of Union General Fighting Joe Hooker, who had just lost the Battle of Chancellorsville back in '63. In February of '63 came the end of the Enquirer, the Leavenworth Enquirer. Quote, this is written by another newspaper, Colonels Anthony, Jennison, and Captain Hoyt, the person I just told you about, proceeded quietly to the office and so demolished it that it can never be of any use hereafter. A small portion of the material was thrown out the window and burnt. There was but little excitement. Had any resistance been made, blood would have been shed. So what has happened here? Anthony basically has eliminated one of his competitors, and the union officials have eliminated anybody who might complain about their rule. So, and I'm going to just point out, in the Times, in Christmas Eve of 1863, there was this little note. There was a play. A group of traveling players had come to the Union Hall that night. Quote, Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, was produced at the Union last night. It was a big old drafty hall. Hamlet had a cold, and so did the audience. I will give you a guess who Hamlet. Think of an actor in this period.
John Wilkes Booth.
John Wilkes Booth.
Wow.
He later went to, on the same trip west, he went to St. Louis where he was arrested for his anti-union comments.
He was also up in St. Joe, too.
Probably.
No, he was.
No, I think he was. I think he had trouble getting through. I think he tried to get back east and the snows were so bad the trains weren't running.
Well, what happened up there, he was out of money, and the citizens actually asked him to give a one-man show up there, and that's how he ended up actually getting out of town.
Yeah.
But it was so cold in the place that they had it, downtown Leavenworth, that people were trying to stay warm, shuffling around, moving. It was real noisy and everything. But yeah, the site's up there, but they've never put a marker up there to give you that history.
You know, if you go to Central Park, you will find a bust about that high of Shakespeare. And the money for that was raised by the Booth brothers,
Yeah.
including John Wilkes. They put on a little play to raise money for that statue.
They said his brother couldn't get much acting after that.
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody confused the two by any means, but I think his heyday had occurred before, but he still was on the stage. He might have gone to England and make it easier.
His name was Mud.
I don't really know. I haven't followed everything in this story. Anthony seems to have no problem with all the hookers in Leavenworth, but he was hard on liquor. When he was in Kansas City, again, he became very unpopular because he shut down the saloons in Kansas City. This was when the 7th/1st Cavalry was defending Kansas City for a brief period. Anyway, he was defeated. He was defeated, and I believe that he went on to a serious career in cattle rustling and brokering of goods from Missouri with Hoyt and Doc Jennison at this point had a overland livery service, wagons and such that were supplying the 49ers, and I believe that he had a good part of that. He later he was in cahoots with Jennison in Leavenworth and everything, but time kind of moved on. He married the rich daughter of a rich shipmaker in Massachusetts, I think, and I think he wanted to go, cattle stealing and fencing Missouri property. He didn't think that would impress his wife. This is my theory. And so he bought another newspaper. This was a small newspaper, and the Bulletin. It's called the Bulletin. But he wasn't poor by any means because Lincoln had made him the postmaster of Leavenworth, so which was a plum patronage job. Anyway, just to give you an idea of how unpopular he was, after the war, he actually bought the Times. So he started with conservative, went to the Bulletin, then bought the Times, which had been his enemy. And that paper is still up there. That's the only paper up there. His family had it for 3 generations, but they sold it out. But he was so unpopular that in 1875, he was at the opera in Leavenworth, and another editor from another newspaper shot him in the neck on the stairs at the opera. And it basically nicked his jugular. And they could only keep him alive by somebody holding his neck, holding a bandage or a gauze or pad to his neck. And they had to keep doing that until finally it scabbed over and healed. And one of the people who was there holding his neck was his sister, Susan B. So history comes around. Anyway, he became a power, and he didn't become any nicer. And he eventually had to install a new invention called steel shutters on his window because people were always throwing bricks through the plate glass. And those shutters were there until not so long ago, I think. In 1891, now he's getting on in years, 1891, the mayor of Leavenworth was fined $30 for whipping Anthony in the streets. Wow. And he was 67 at the time. Anthony was 67 years old. But that wasn't it. Not long after that, he was horsewhipped by another assailant who was fined $100 for the fine, for the assault. The newspapers in that town took up a $5 subscription. Everybody just contribute 5 cents and we'll pay off the man's fine because Anthony always deserves a whipping. So that's a true story. Let's go back to the war now. We've talked about these two people and their impact, both three. As we know, in 1863, Lawrence visited Lawrence. So Quantrell visited Lawrence. 3 papers were there, the Tribune, the Republican, and the Journal. All were burned out. John Spear, who I believe he was the publisher of the Tribune, he lost 2 sons in that raid. one of which was burned and his body was never found in the Torch print shop. Sometime before this, Quantrill had attacked Olathe, although not with the same bloody-mindedness, and had destroyed the Herald and the Mirror there. So, you know, times were tough for Kansas newspapers that were within riding distance of the Missouri line. There was a local correspondent for the Times, New York Times, in Lawrence, who died that day. And not too long after that, as Quantrill was taking his men south to Texas because the heat was on in Missouri, you may know the story of Baxter Springs, where General Blunt was moving his headquarters from Fort Scott to Fort Smith, and his column was ambushed by Quantrill and somewhat wiped out. Well, what was really wiped out was the bandwagon. He was taking his band with him, and somebody in the wagon, as they were fleeing toward Fort Baxter, had the bad luck to shoot and kill one of Quantrill's favorite men, and so they were all summarily executed. Their sheet music was piled in the wagon on their bodies and set fire. One of the drummer boy was not dead. He dragged himself burning through the weeds, and they found his body later. So band members should not be using pistols. This is more to that story. But in that wagon was also the correspondent to Frank Leslie's Weekly, which was the equivalent of Life magazine, Time magazine, and several other things. These were really important publications in American history, with lots and lots of pictures of the war and lots of stories and profiles and things like that. It was serious soft journalism. Where were all the correspondents during the Battle of Westport? And I think there were correspondents at Wilson's Creek. But, you know, I think I've just answered my question. There really weren't that many battles here, and Sherman and Grant were all moving east. You know, they were all pushing toward Atlanta and Chattanooga and Cumberland Gap, and then of course Grant, before you knew it, was over commanding the forces in Virginia. And so all the correspondents were over there. So there was hardly any correspondence recording what was going on for the national newspapers. Now Lawrence, the burning of Lawrence, was written about and read about all over the world. It was a very, very big deal. The Richmond newspaper said they deserved it, and the northern newspaper said it was barbarism. But I want to tell you about one reporter who worked for the New York Times before going east with Grant. His name was Frank Bangs Wilkie, and he had gotten his start with that editor I mentioned in Iowa, who had been thrown in prison for being not towing the line, the Union line. And I just love this, because if you know Sedalia, or know anybody in Sedalia, you want to pass this quote. He wrote in 1861 about Sedalia. He called it a God-forsaken kernel of filth, and all possible mean things, the center of a region accursed as if blasted by the simoon of death. Okay. We know what happened after Lawrence. Order number 11 was signed by General Ewing, and generals don't get their hands dirty doing that sort of thing. They leave it to an officer named the Provost Marshal, who is basically a semi-judicial standing as well as military rank. The Provost Marshal for Ewing was Van Horn.
Ooh.
He'd gotten out of the swamps, and you know, people say, and
He gets a school named after him.
Yeah.
You need to demand that name get changed.
You know what happened, you know, because of the war, they all Yankees.
that school I don't believe is in Harrisonville or Nevada or Camden Point. I think that's in Kansas City, safely in Kansas City. So anyway, They say he actually was as humane as he could. Well, he tried to be humane. Let's just say that. There were people who, I mean, I think Bingham, who hated Ewing. I think Bingham gave Van Horn some credit for not being as mean as he could have been. And I told you that Van Horn built the bridge. Well, so we've gone through 1863. I know you guys were thinking, God bless it, but I have to tell you, man, we're not going to be done until we get like to 1890. But anyway, sterling prices march through Missouri. We know all about that. And an interesting thing happened in Leavenworth. Again, the Journal of Western Commerce was still going on in Kansas City, but the big dogs were fighting it out in Leavenworth. And the conservative was, again, pro-Lane and very much pro-fighting. The Times was very Union and Republican, but they hated Lane. Remember, they were Kearney's newspaper. They hated Lane, and anything Lane wanted to do, they didn't want to do. It's kind of like some of the stuff you see in Washington these days. When Price was approaching Leavenworth, they insisted, the Times insisted, that Price had already turned south and was going to Arkansas. The conservative said, no, he's not. And General Blunt could have told him, if they had been able to get a telegraph line back to Leavenworth, that no, he's not. But Blunt was considered to be Lane's man, and he was to a certain extent. And I mean, on October 22nd, the Confederates have already pushed through Lexington. They pushed through Independence. They've actually crossed the river, the Blue River. Shelby has spit into Brush Creek. And not only the Leavenworth Times, but the Kansas City Daily Journal of Western Commerce says Price has gone south. He's not there. I mean, now, in the Journal's defense, they ran somebody else's story, because they could hear the goddamn gunfire. That is the strangest thing, to see that in that paper. I mean, Leavenworth is, far away, and again, it was a political fight. It was so political that when Price was in Independence and then south of the Westport, and as you know, the Kansas militia was just a mess right there. Units were walking away. They were being marched away, and their commanders were being arrested in the days before the Battle of Westport, and they wouldn't go any farther than the Blue River. They wouldn't go into Independence because why was that? Why wouldn't they do that? Because they thought it was a trick. They thought Lane and the conservative were trying to trick them to grab their guns and go out of Missouri so they could not vote in the elections that were going to occur in a few days. That's how suspicious they were. They were wrong, of course. But anyway, the provost marshal in Leavenworth was pretty put out by the Times, and he wrote Curtis, who by this time was in Kansas City. He telegraphed him. He says, "Am of the opinion that the paper, that is the Times, should be temporarily suspended and editors and writers arrested as enemies to the public and cause. Please instruct. Of course, the paper is highly treasonous at this time." And I think being a pressman and not being in favor of generals taking over newspapers, I think he had a point. But anyway, we know what happened at Westport. Let me just point out that the Journal was so in the Union pocket that this is what they wrote when they looked at the bodies of the Southerners, I assume, around what we would call Loose Park today, on Bloody Lane, which was the Fort Scott Road / now Warner Road. Looking at those bodies, they weren't looking at their brothers. They seemed to belong to a different race from ours, and most certainly to an inferior one. In truth, this war is one of intelligence, enlightened, and Christian civilization against barbarism. This is something I found interesting. This is something that if I come back to you guys and tell you a story about all the massacres in the 1864 campaign. This will be one of them. The newspaper remarked on the superior weaponry or marksmanship of the Union soldiers because so many of the Confederates they saw had headshots. You know how they got those headshots, don't you? Oh, you surrendered?
Yeah.
Kind of like Colonel Phillips,
Great shot.
who had really good accuracy and marksmanship down at Lion Creek. Well, anyway, so the Westport campaign, more or less, was Jesse James came up and killed a few more people, and his buddies. But the war was over. Missouri did not suffer Reconstruction, but it did suffer the Drake Constitution, which was very onerous on ex-Confederates, Democrats, and even some moderate Republicans. I knew of an editor up in Rawls County that was not allowed to vote because even though he'd been in the Army, he did not toe the line of the playbanks. So I want to tell you really quickly, and bear with me. I can wrap it up any time, but I do have a couple more interesting stories. We all know that two of the top generals in the Battle of Westport and running around in Missouri under Price, unfortunately for them, were Joe Shelby and John Marmaduke. They each had adjutants, and I'm sure you've heard their names. I don't have Moore's, but this is John Edwards. And he wrote some of the floweriest reports. If you read his stuff from the campaign of '64 earlier, I mean, you can tell there is a poet that's trying to break out. And he wrote some terrible stuff, but he was flowery and he was funny. He and Moore started a newspaper called The Times. Now, don't confuse it with the Leavenworth Times. I think we're done with the Leavenworth Times, and we're not going to talk about the New York Times anymore, I don't think. This is the Kansas City Times. And when I started at the Kansas City Star, we were the afternoon paper, and the Times was the morning paper because Nelson, our publisher, had bought the Times. I don't know, 1890, 1899, something like that. And so we put out two papers. And I actually wrote for the Kansas City Times when my stories weren't done in time for the Kansas City Star, the afternoon paper. Kansas City Times was a very, very southern paper. This was a time when there was a deep split. Missouri was very democratic, certainly in the countryside. There was a newspaper, and the Democrats, of course, were being crushed by the powerful right-wing radical Republicans that were also, impeaching Johnson and such, and imposing Reconstruction. And at the time, there was this masthead still exists in some form. I'm not sure what, but it's my favorite masthead in the world. It's called the Unterrified Democrat. And in Lexington, they were defiant as well, and they had a paper, as somebody here was noting, was the Lexington Caucasian. I'm not sure what you knew what side they were. Well, the radical paper in Kansas City was the Times, and they thought that Jesse James and the former Confederates walked on water. And this was in 1868 or 69, so it really wasn't that long after the war. So here's an example of their coverage. This occurred in October of 1872, like 7 years after the war. In the glare of the day and in the teeth of the multitude, the Kansas City Industrial Exposition Fair was robbed of nearly $1,000 in ticket receipts. This is just a couple blocks east of where the Kansas City Star sits today. The revolver discharged, a little girl was hit in the leg by a stray bullet. Newspapers across the country were outraged, bellowed about crime in the streets. Where was a constable when you needed one? But the Times was pretty relaxed about this. It said, pardon me. Oh, the Times said, there is a dash of tiger's blood in the veins of all men, a latent disposition even in the bosom that is a stranger to nerve and daring to admire those qualities in other men. In other words, you know, yeah, they're robbers and they shot a little girl, but God, dashing and brave to do that in broad daylight. A few weeks later, the Times got a letter from a guy named Jack Shepard, Dick Turpin, and Claude Duval. And they said their feelings were hurt by the bad things that were being written about them and all that fake newspapers. We are not thieves, they wrote. We are bold robbers. What have we done to be hung for? Apparently people were calling me to be hung. It is true that I shot a little girl, but although it was not intentional, and I'm very sorry that the child was shot, just give us her address and we'll raise some money and we'll take care of the doctor's bill. There's really no... And then they went on and said, they said they were not scum, as the newspapers were writing. That is, they were not Republicans. Grant's party has no respect for anyone. They rob the poor and the rich while we rob the rich and give to the poor. So who was the person who wrote that letter? Jack Shepard.
AKA Jesse James or something, probably.
It was Jesse James. So Edwards knew it was Jesse James, and he probably helped him write the thing. Because I doubt very much if Jesse James knew who Jack Shepard, Dick Turpin, and Claude Duval were. But anyway, Edwards and Moore later became famous for writing Edwards, not Moore. Edwards became famous for writing a book that glorified Jesse and Frank, and he also wrote a book about the Missouri guerrillas, or no, not guerrillas, I guess, maybe something else, but also about Shelby, and the fighting in Missouri. Can't remember the title of it, but he just couldn't hold himself back, and he was so flowery that when he talks about the Battle of Westport, which he says they won, the Southerners won the Battle of Westport, and they withdrew from the battlefield through the mountains south of town. Mountains? So anyway, whatever pumped that copy up a little bit. Okay, we were whipped and we were running as fast as we could over between those bluffs on the blue, but let's make it look good. It was the mountains. We got through the mountains. Okay, so we're going to talk about Edwards a little bit more, and then Edwards was a brave man. They say more horses were shot out from him than any other man in Shelby's unit. He was wounded at Gerardo. He sold the Times and went to St. Louis, where I think, what paper did he work for? It wasn't the Post-Dispatch, certainly. Yeah, I think it might have been the St. Louis Times. But anyway, he went over there, and he got angry because another newspaper, the Journal, he thought the Journal had written something that made Edwards think he was being called a liar. And it had to do with Jeff Davis coming or not coming to a fair in Illinois. It was really nothing. But Edwards challenged the other editor of the Journal to a duel.
Barely fair.
What's that?
That's a barely fair fight.
Like I say, the man might have written flowery copy, but he was not immune to the smell of gunpowder. And the other editor was no slouch either. His name was Emory Foster, and he had been an officer in command of the Union forces at Lone Jack, which put up a pretty goddamn good fight. And in fact, they might have won, except he took one through the lung or something, and they dragged him off to the blacksmith shop? Or
Cave house.
Huh?
The cave house.
Oh, the cave house. Oh, the house? I thought the cave house?
Cave
Oh,
house.
wasn't it already
I
burned?
thought the cave
by
house
then?
was burning. I
Not
think they
yet.
took him over to the blacksmith shop. Well, I'm no expert in this anymore. Anyway, this is the place where Cole Younger steps in and keeps him from being shot. And later,